You know, after 40 years on this bench, I thought I had seen everything. I have watched grown men break down and cry. I have watched powerful people crumble under the weight of their own lies. I have seen every excuse you can possibly imagine. Dogs eating ticket stubs, envelopes lost in the mail, calendars mixed up, bosses who didn't give the day off, babies who were sick, cars that wouldn't start. I have heard them all. But on a Tuesday morning in October, a 17-year-old kid walked into my courtroom and said 6 words to me that stopped me cold. 6 words. He looked me right in the eyes and he said, "Your Honor, I don't want to lie." I had to stop. I had to put down the folder I was holding. Because in 40 years, sitting on this bench in Providence, Rhode Island, I can count on one hand the number of people who walked in here and said that to me before I even asked a single question. 6 words. And they came from a kid who could have been my grandson. But before I tell you this whole story, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Because what I'm about to share with you is something that needs to be heard. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single word of this. Now let me take you back. Let me tell you about who I am and why this moment hit me the way it did. My name is Frank Caprio. I have been a judge in Providence, Rhode Island for over 40 years. Every single morning, I walk into that courthouse and I feel the same thing I felt on my very first day. A sense of responsibility, a sense of weight, because what happens in that room matters. It matters to real people. It matters to families. It matters to a young woman trying to keep her job and her driver's license at the same time. It matters to an elderly man who got confused on a one-way street. It matters to a kid who made one bad decision on a Wednesday afternoon. Every single case matters. Every single person standing before me is a human being with a story. And after 40 years, I never forget that. I've had my morning coffee the same way for as long as I can remember. Strong, black, no sugar. Christina, my clerk, knows exactly how I like it. She has it ready on my bench before I even sit down. I always say thank you, always. My father taught me that. He said, "Frank, the people who do the quiet work, the ones who show up every day and do their job without asking for applause, those are the people who hold this world together. Show them they matter." So I say thank you to Christina every single morning. I always will. My father was an extraordinary man. He came to this country from Italy with nothing but hope, a strong back, and a work ethic that would make most people tired just watching him. He worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs when I was young. He never complained. He never cut corners. He told me once, "Frank, the way you do the small things is the way you do everything. Don't cheat on the small things because you think no one is watching. Someone is always watching, and even when they're not, you are, and you have to live with yourself." I carried those words with me into law school. I carried them with me when I first started practicing law, and I carry them with me every single morning when I put on these robes. I put them on with both hands, deliberately, because I know what they represent. They represent something bigger than me. They represent fairness. They represent the idea that in this country, when you walk into a courtroom, the law doesn't care how much money is in your bank account. It doesn't care what your last name is. It doesn't care who your father knows. What it cares about is what you did and who you are. That's what I believe. That's what I've always believed. I've been married to my wife for 48 years. She is the most patient, most gracious woman I have ever known. She can read me like a book. When I come home after a hard day, she knows before I even take my coat off. She'll put her hand on my arm and say, "Frank, tell me about it." And I do. I tell her everything. She is my anchor. She reminds me that beyond those courtroom walls, there is a world of regular people just trying to live their lives with dignity. She keeps me humble. She keeps me grounded. And on the nights when I sit at the kitchen table, wondering if I made the right decision in a difficult case, she always says the same thing. She says, "Frank, if you made your decision with an honest heart, then you made the right one." That's all any of us can do. I have 2 sons and a daughter. I have grandchildren. My youngest grandson just turned 12 last spring. I took him to a baseball game and watched him laugh at everything, delighted by the world, unbothered by its complications. I thought to myself, I want to protect that. I want to do my job well enough that the world he grows up in is a little more fair, a little more honest than it might otherwise be. That's why I still do this after 40 years. Not because I have to, because I believe it matters. Now, every morning when I go through my case files, I try to prepare myself for the range of what I'm going to see. Some days it's mostly parking tickets, expired meters, wrong zones, that kind of thing. Other days it's moving violations, license suspensions, things that can genuinely change a person's life. And then some days you get a combination of things. You get a morning where the ordinary and the extraordinary sit side by side in the same room, where a routine ticket suddenly becomes a window into someone's entire life. Those are the days I remember. The Tuesday morning this particular story took place, it started like every other Tuesday. I got to the courthouse at 8:15. Been doing that since 1984. I walked down the hallway, nodded to the officers at the door, and made my way to my bench. Christina was there with the coffee. She handed me the folder for the morning's cases. I flipped through it quickly, scanning names and charges. Mostly standard stuff. Parking violations, a couple of speeding tickets, 1 suspended registration. Nothing on that sheet of paper told me what was coming. Nothing could have. I remember it was a cool October morning. I could see through the window that the sky was that deep, clear blue that only happens in New England in the fall. There's something about October in Providence that I love. The air is clean. The light is sharp. The trees are on fire with color. It's the kind of morning that makes you feel grateful to be alive and walking around. I had my coffee. I had my files. I had Christina organizing the docket. Everything was exactly as it should be. The gallery was filling up. I could hear people finding their seats. I could hear the murmur of quiet conversations, some nervous, some just tired, some a little irritated about having to be there at all. That's normal. Most people don't want to be in court. That's not an insult. Court is not supposed to be somewhere you enjoy going. It's somewhere you go when something has gone sideways, when you need the law to step in and sort out what you couldn't sort out on your own. So I understand the tension. I've always understood it. I called the first few cases of the morning without incident. An elderly woman with 3 overdue parking tickets. She was sweet and confused, and I could tell she was genuinely worried. I talked with her. I found out she was going through some medical treatments and had lost track of some of her mail. I reduced the fines and gave her time to pay. She thanked me in a voice that was barely above a whisper. That's the kind of moment that doesn't make headlines, but those are the moments I hold on to. Then I got to a man in his late 50s, nice suit, moving violation. He told me the ticket was wrong, that the officer had misread the speed limit sign on that particular stretch of road. He was polite, but confident, a little too confident. I've seen that kind before, the kind who believe that their polish and their posture will carry the day. I listened to him. I asked him questions. I looked at the report. The report was clear. I said, "Sir, I've reviewed the evidence and the charge is supported." His expression shifted just slightly, that flicker of surprise that people get when they realize the polish didn't work. I gave him a reduced fine, and he sat back down. He wasn't happy, but he accepted it. And then around 9:30 in the morning, Christina called the next case. I looked down at my sheet. The name was Marcus Webb, 17 years old. The charge was operating a motor vehicle without a valid license. I watched him walk in from the back of my courtroom. He was a teenager, thin, maybe 5'10", still a little uneven in that way teenagers are when they've grown fast but haven't quite filled out yet. He was wearing clean clothes, dark jeans, and a plain navy blue sweatshirt. His sneakers were a little worn at the toe. He had a backpack over one shoulder, which told me he'd come straight from school or was going to go straight to school afterward. His hair was neat. His posture was straight. He wasn't slouching the way some young people do when they're nervous and trying to look like they don't care. He was walking like someone who had decided to face this head on. I noticed his hands. He held them at his sides, not shoved in his pockets. His jaw was set. But his eyes gave him away. He wasn't scared exactly, but he was serious. This kid was taking this seriously, and that right there told me something about him before he even opened his mouth. He stepped up to the podium in front of my bench. He set his backpack down at his feet. He stood up straight. He looked at me directly, not at the floor, not at the ceiling, not at the side wall, at me. And there was something in that gaze that I recognized. It was the look of someone who had been raised with values. Someone had told this young man that when you face a difficult moment, you look it in the eye. I said to him, "Good morning. Are you Marcus Webb?" He said, "Yes, sir," he was. I said, "Marcus, you've been charged with operating a motor vehicle without a valid license. How do you plead?" And that's when it happened. That's when he said the 6 words. He said, "Your Honor, I don't want to lie." I had to pause. I remember that I was holding my pen, ready to make a note, and I actually stopped writing. I looked up at him over the top of my glasses, and I said, "Good." Then he took a breath, and he told me everything. Now let me pause here for just a second. I need to ask you something. Have you ever met someone who walked into a tough situation and just told the plain truth, even when it hurt them, even when they knew the truth might make things harder? Have you ever seen that kind of courage in a young person? Leave me a comment because I actually read them. And if you're enjoying this story so far, hit that like button for me. Because what this young man said next is something I still think about. Marcus told me that his mother had a medical emergency. She called him from work and told him she was having chest pains and couldn't drive herself to the hospital. She was a single mother. There was no one else to call. His father wasn't in the picture. His older sister lived across town and didn't have a car. His mother told him where her car keys were, and she told him to take a cab or find another way. She did not tell him to drive. I want you to hear that clearly. His mother told him not to drive. She knew he didn't have a license yet. She told him to figure out another way. But Marcus told me that he tried calling for a ride share and the app kept crashing. He tried calling his mother back and she wasn't answering. He said he stood in the kitchen for about 4 minutes. He remembered it was exactly 4 minutes because he looked at the clock twice, and then he picked up those keys. He drove his mother's car 6.5 miles to the hospital. He drove carefully. He stopped at every light. He came to complete stops at every stop sign. He did not speed. He drove as safely as a 17-year-old kid with no license could drive, because his mother was the most important person in his world, and she needed him. He made it to the hospital. His mother was seen immediately. She had been having a serious cardiac episode. The doctors told him later that the timing mattered, that getting her there when he did had made a difference. His mother was fine. She recovered. She was sitting right there in the back of my courtroom. I looked up and I saw her, a woman in her early 40s, wearing a light blue coat with the same direct eyes as her son. She was holding a handkerchief, but she wasn't crying. She was watching her son stand at that podium with a kind of quiet pride that almost broke my heart. And then Marcus said something else. He said, "Your Honor, I know what I did was against the law. I know I didn't have a license. I'm not trying to say it was the right thing legally. I just couldn't leave her there. And I want you to know what happened, because I don't want to stand up here and make excuses or tell you a story that isn't true. I'd rather take the consequences than lie to you." I had to take a breath. I'm telling you, I had to collect myself. Because I've had thousands of people stand in front of me and ask me to excuse them from their mistakes. Most of them tell me exactly what they think I want to hear. They shape their stories. They leave out the parts that don't help them. Some of them flat out lie. I don't hold it against them entirely. When people are scared, they protect themselves. It's human nature. But this young man did the exact opposite. He stood up there without a lawyer, without a parent coaching him what to say, and he told me the whole truth, even the parts that didn't make him look good. He admitted that his mother had told him not to drive. He admitted that anyway. He said it himself, without me asking. I leaned forward on my bench. I looked at him for a long moment, and I said, "Marcus, you told me you don't want to lie." I said, "I appreciate that more than you know." Then I asked him, "Are you in school?" He said yes. He was a junior at his high school. He said he had a part-time job after school to help his mother with the bills. He said he'd been saving up for driving school because he wanted to get his license the right way. He'd signed up for the course, but hadn't been able to complete it yet because of work. I asked him what his grades were like. He looked a little surprised by the question, but he answered honestly. He said he was carrying a B average, that math was hard for him, but he was working on it. He said his favorite subject was history because, and I remember his exact words here, he said because everything that's happening now has already happened before, and if you pay attention, you can learn from it. I looked at him when he said that. I said, "Son, you might be wiser than you know." I looked out at his mother in the gallery. She was watching her son with everything she had. I thought about my own sons at 17. I thought about the mornings I drove them to school and watched them walk through those doors, hoping the world would be fair to them. I thought about what it means to raise a child on your own, to work and struggle and still make sure your kid knows right from wrong. This woman had done that. Whatever else was going on in that family's life, she had done that. Her son stood up in my courtroom at 17 years old and told the truth when most adults in that room would have lied. I looked back at Marcus. I said, "Marcus, I'm going to tell you something. In 40 years on this bench, do you know what the most valuable thing anyone can bring into this courtroom?" He looked at me and waited. I said, "The truth. That's it. Not a good lawyer, not a good excuse, not a sympathetic story. The truth. That's what you gave me today, and that matters." I said that given the extraordinary circumstances, given the fact that he drove to save his mother's life, and given the remarkable honesty and character he had shown by standing before me and telling the whole truth without being asked, I was dismissing the charge. I told him that I was making a note of the circumstances in the record, and I said that I hoped he would get that driving course completed and get his license the legal way. I also said that I was going to be watching to see what this young man did with his life, because if he brought this same honesty and character to everything else he did, the world was going to be a better place for it. The courtroom was quiet for just a second, and then it wasn't. I heard applause start somewhere in the back. I don't always allow that, but that morning I let it go for a moment. I let those people in my courtroom recognize something real. I saw Marcus exhale. His shoulders came down from where they'd been, up near his ears, held tight with the tension of a kid waiting to hear his fate. He said, "Thank you, Your Honor," and he meant it. I could hear it. I said, "No, thank you, Marcus. Don't forget this moment." He picked up his backpack. He walked back to where his mother was sitting. She reached for his hand. I had to look at my papers for a moment. I'm not ashamed to tell you that my eyes were not entirely dry. After 40 years, certain moments still get to you. They're supposed to. Now I want to tell you what happened next in my courtroom that morning, because the story doesn't end with Marcus. In fact, what came after is what made that day one of the most memorable in my career. Because just when you think you've seen the best of people, you get a reminder that character is not universal. And sometimes the contrast between two people in the same room on the same morning tells you everything you need to know about what matters in this life. Just before Marcus's case, while I was still going through the earlier part of my docket, I noticed a woman in the gallery. I noticed her because she stood out in the way that someone with a lot of money sometimes stands out in a room full of regular people. She was maybe 45 years old, well-dressed. Her outfit was expensive. I don't know fashion well, but even I could see that everything she was wearing was the kind of thing that cost serious money. Her hair was perfect. Her nails were perfect. She carried a handbag that I later found out cost more than most people in that room made in a month. What drew my eye to her wasn't the clothes, it was her attitude. While other people in the gallery were sitting quietly, respectfully, waiting their turn, this woman was on her phone. not quietly. I could see the light from the screen from my bench. She was scrolling, texting, completely checked out of where she was. And when Marcus's mother came in and sat near her, I watched this woman give a little sideways look and shift her body away, like she was positioning herself to not be associated with the people around her. I saw that. I don't miss much from up here. I've seen that kind of attitude before. The kind that says, I don't really belong here with these people. I'm here by mistake, and I'll be out in 5 minutes. That attitude doesn't make me angry on its own. What makes me concerned is when it bleeds into how someone treats others. And I had a feeling about this woman. My gut was telling me to pay attention when her name came up. Sure enough, about 40 minutes into the session, Christina called her case. The woman's name was Diane Hargrove. She stood up from her seat like she was mildly inconvenienced. She walked up to the podium with the kind of easy confidence that people carry when they've never had to be truly accountable for anything in their lives. She didn't look nervous. She looked like she was slightly bored. The charge was interesting. It was a parking violation, but not just one. She had accumulated 11 unpaid parking tickets over the course of about 8 months. 11. The total owed was significant. More than that, she had ignored every notice sent to her address. The city had made multiple attempts to contact her. She had simply not responded. Not once. I said, Ms. Hargrove, you have 11 outstanding parking violations totaling over $1,200 in fines and penalties. Do you understand the charges? She said, yes, Your Honor, and I actually said something to the officer about this. She was already pivoting, already setting up her narrative. I said, and what was that? She said, well, some of those tickets are from a period when my car was in the shop. I don't believe I was even using the vehicle during those weeks. I looked at the dates. The dates on the tickets spanned from a Thursday in January all the way through an August weekend. I asked her, Ms. Hargrove, do you have documentation from the repair shop? She paused. She said, I'd have to look into that. I said, you'd have to look into that. She nodded and smiled at me like that was a perfectly acceptable answer. Like somehow the fact that she might, at some point, be able to provide a document she didn't currently have should solve the problem right now. I've been on this bench long enough to recognize when someone isn't being entirely straight with me. It's not always that they're outright lying. Sometimes it's more subtle than that. It's the small gap between what they're saying and the full truth. The convenient memory. The documentation they'd have to look into. The detail that shifts depending on which version of the story they're telling. I'm going to be honest with you. At this point, I was struggling to keep my composure, not because I was angry, but because I had just watched a 17-year-old kid stand in the exact same spot and give me every difficult truth about himself without being asked. And now I was watching a grown woman with obvious resources dance around the simplest of questions. If you've ever felt that kind of frustration, watching someone disrespect something important, watching someone treat honesty as optional, you know exactly what I mean. Hit that like button if you're still with me. And make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next, I never saw coming. I told Ms. Hargrove that I had reviewed the records and that the tickets were properly issued and documented. I told her that the time for providing evidence had been available for months and that she had not availed herself of any of the processes in place for disputing violations. I asked her directly, Ms. Hargrove, Did you receive the notices from the city? She said she may have received some of them. I said, may have? She said, I receive a lot of mail. Your Honor, I'm sure you understand that someone in my position, and she actually said that, someone in my position, gets an overwhelming amount of correspondence. I looked at her for a long moment. I leaned forward slightly. I said, Ms. Hargrove, I want to make sure I understand what you're telling me. Are you saying that because you receive a lot of mail, the laws of this city don't apply to you the same way they apply to everyone else? She blinked. She seemed surprised that I'd put it that way. She said, that's not what I meant, Your Honor. I said, good, because in my courtroom, a nurse and a business executive stand on exactly the same ground. The law doesn't care what your position is. It cares about what you did. She wasn't happy. I could see it in the way she adjusted her posture. She was recalibrating, trying to figure out another angle. She said, Your Honor, I would like to pay the fines. I've brought my credit card. I could take care of this right now, today, and we could all move on. I heard a small sound from the gallery, not quite a laugh, more like a breath of disbelief, because what she was essentially suggesting was that the whole inconvenience of being in my courtroom could be resolved by the swipe of a card, as if the problem was never the tickets, but the fact that she'd been asked to show up. I said, Miss Hargrove, paying the fines is not the issue. The issue is the complete disregard for over 8 months of official correspondence. The issue is 11 separate incidents where you parked where you knew you shouldn't, and then chose, repeatedly, not to address the consequences. I said, you can pay the fines, but I'm also going to tell you something for free. The way you handle the small obligations in your life says a great deal about your character. And today, this court has seen what it needed to see. She paid the fines. She did not look happy about it. She walked back to collect her things from the gallery, and I watched her move through the room with that same slightly elevated posture, that same expression of mild injury, like the universe had been unreasonable to her. She picked up that expensive handbag without making eye contact with anyone around her. And just before she walked out, I watched her pass right by where Marcus and his mother were still sitting, waiting for the paperwork on his dismissal to be processed. She didn't see them. She looked right through them. I saw Marcus's mother watch her walk by. Their eyes met for just a second, and what I saw on that woman's face was not bitterness or anger. It was something more quiet. It was patience. The patience of someone who has spent a lifetime being looked through and has made peace with it, because they know their worth doesn't depend on being seen by the right people. That hit me hard, I have to tell you. That one small moment between those two women, one of whom never even knew the exchange happened, said more about character than anything I'd ruled on all morning. I thought about what makes a person. I thought about the choices we make when we think no one is watching. And I thought about the choices we make when everyone is watching. Miss Hargrove, with all her polish and all her money, had walked into my courtroom and spent the entire time trying to maneuver around the truth. And Marcus, a 17-year-old kid with worn sneakers and a part-time job, had walked in and handed me the truth without being asked. He had done it at personal cost. He had done it because someone had taught him that honesty is not something you practice when it's convenient. It's something you practice all the time, or it means nothing. Now, before I tell you what happened later that day, because the story goes further, let me ask you something. Do you think that what we teach our children about honesty actually shapes who they become? Do you think character is built at home, or do you think people are just born with it or without it? Tell me what you think in the comments. I read every single one. And if you believe, like I do, that what we model for our children is one of the most important things we do, hit that subscribe button, because that's what this community is about. Later that afternoon, around 2 o'clock, I was in my chambers, going over paperwork from the morning session. I had a cup of coffee, my second of the day, also black, also strong. I was thinking about Marcus. I was thinking about those 6 words. Your Honor, I don't want to lie. I was writing some notes because I wanted to remember the details of that morning clearly. I always make notes on the cases that matter to me, not for the record, for myself, for those late evenings when I need to remember why I do this. Christina knocked on my door. She said there was someone who wanted to speak with me if I had a moment. I said, send them in. I expected it might be one of the morning's defendants with a follow-up question, but it was Marcus. He stood in the doorway of my chambers with his backpack, and he said, Your Honor, I hope it's okay that I came back. I wanted to thank you in person without everybody watching. I gestured to the chair across from my desk and told him to sit down. He sat down carefully, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to get too comfortable. I said, Marcus, you already thanked me. He said, I know, but you said something out there that I wanted to ask you about. He said, you said the truth was the most valuable thing someone could bring into a courtroom. And I wanted to know if you really meant that, not just as a judge saying something official, but if you really meant it. I put down my pen. I looked at this 17-year-old sitting across from me in my chambers, asking me with the most direct and genuine eyes whether I really meant what I said. And I told him the truth. I said, Marcus, I've been doing this for 40 years. I have had lawyers in here who can argue both sides of the same case with equal conviction. I have had people who can cry on cue and people who can lie with the steadiest voice you've ever heard. I have had charm and money and influence try to walk through that courtroom door and rewrite the facts. And you know what always cuts through all of it? The truth. Every single time, the truth is the only thing that actually holds. Everything else falls apart eventually. The truth doesn't fall apart. He nodded slowly. He said, my mother always told me that the truth always comes out. I said, your mother is a wise woman. He said, I know. He paused for a second. Then he said, I was scared this morning. I want you to know that. I didn't want to seem like I wasn't scared. But I decided last night that I was going to come in here and just say everything. Because if I lied and you found out, or even if you didn't find out, I'd know. And I couldn't live with that. I want you to sit with that for a second. A 17-year-old kid, the night before his court appearance, deciding that he could not live with the idea of lying to a judge, even if it would have worked. Not because someone was watching, because he would know, because he had to live with himself. I said, Marcus, you just told me something more important than you realize. I said, the ability to look yourself in the mirror and feel right about what you see, that's the whole game. That's everything. More than success, more than money, more than people thinking well of you. If you can walk through your life making choices you can defend to yourself at the end of every day, you will be okay. I promise you that. We talked for a little while longer. I asked him about his future plans. He said he wanted to study criminal justice. He said he'd been thinking about it for a while. He said, "I want to help people who get into trouble but are actually good people who just made a mistake." I almost smiled. I said, "Marcus, that's exactly what this system is supposed to do." I said, "You'd be good at it." He said, "How do you know?" I said, "Because you already understand the most important part, which is that the truth is where you start. Everything else builds from there." When he got up to leave, he shook my hand. A firm, real handshake. I said, "Go get that driver's license." He laughed for the first time all day. It was a good laugh, young and genuine and unguarded. He said he'd already looked up new dates for the driving course. After he left, I sat in my chambers for a few minutes in quiet. I thought about my own sons when they were his age. I thought about the conversations I had tried to have with them about integrity, about what it means to be honest, not just when it's easy, but when it costs you something. Because honesty that doesn't cost you anything doesn't prove very much. It's the honesty that comes with a risk attached. That's the honesty that reveals character. I thought about Diane Hargrove, about 11 parking tickets and all the correspondence she couldn't quite bring herself to deal with, about the convenient inability to remember, about the phrase, "someone in my position." I have met many people in my position over 40 years. Some of them were among the finest human beings I've ever known. And some of them were living proof that having a position means nothing if you don't have the character to fill it with integrity. What gets me is how often I see the two sitting right next to each other, a Marcus and a Diane Hargrove, in the same room on the same morning. The contrast is so sharp it almost seems planned, like the universe is making a point. And maybe it is. Maybe those mornings exist to remind me that this work is worth doing. Because when a Marcus walks into your courtroom, it justifies everything. It justifies every hard day, every complicated ruling, every moment of frustration. Because the system, when it works, when it's fair, when it's honest, it can see a Marcus Webb and say, "I see you." And that matters. You know what keeps me doing this job after 40 years? Moments like these. Seeing a young person walk in here with nothing but his truth and his courage, and watching justice honor that. If this story is doing something for you right now, if you're feeling what I'm feeling as I tell it, show me by hitting that subscribe button and that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear this message, because these stories need to be told. Now let me tell you what happened in the weeks and months after that Tuesday morning in October, because this story has a few more chapters, and they're good ones. About 3 weeks after that court appearance, I received a letter in the mail at the courthouse. Christina brought it in and set it on my desk. It was handwritten. I don't get many handwritten letters anymore. Everything is electronic. But this was a real letter, written on plain white paper, in a neat and careful hand. It was from Marcus. He wrote that he had enrolled in the driving course and had already completed the first 3 sessions. He wrote that he was getting his driving hours logged with the help of his uncle who lived nearby. He wrote that his mother was doing well and had started a new medication that was making a real difference for her heart. And then he wrote something at the end that I have kept. I still have that letter. I can tell you exactly what it said because I've read it more than once. He wrote, "Your Honor, I don't know if you remember me, but I'm the kid who came in last month and said I didn't want to lie. You told me the truth was the most valuable thing a person could bring into your courtroom. I wanted you to know that I've been thinking about that, and I've decided I'm going to make that true in every room I walk into, not just a courtroom. Thank you for seeing me that day." I read that twice before I put it down. I thought, this is why. This is exactly why. A letter from a 17-year-old kid who had one court appearance and walked away with something he was going to carry for the rest of his life. Not a fine, not a punishment, a conversation, a moment of genuine connection between a judge and a young man that changed the trajectory of how he thought about himself. I wrote him back. I told him that I did remember him, that his case had stayed with me. I told him to keep going. I told him that the world needs people who decide early on what kind of person they're going to be, and then go about being that person consistently, without fanfare, without waiting to be recognized. I told him I had a feeling he was going to be one of those people. About a year later, Christina came into my chambers holding something. She was smiling, not her regular working smile, but her real one, the one she saves for things that actually delight her. She handed me a printout. It was from the local newspaper's website, a small article about a high school student who had won a statewide essay contest on the topic of civic responsibility. The winner had written about truth and accountability, about what it means to hold yourself to a standard even when no one else is demanding it, about a moment in his life when he'd had to choose between the easy thing and the honest thing, and what he'd learned from choosing honesty. The winner was Marcus Webb. I sat back in my chair and I let that settle over me. That kid had taken one morning, one hard, nerve-wracking morning in a courtroom he never wanted to be in, and turned it into something he built on. He'd taken my words, which were really just my father's words passed down to me, and he'd made them his own. He'd written about that morning honestly, the same way he'd spoken about it in my courtroom, without flinching, without prettying it up. His essay talked about his mother, about the 4 minutes standing in the kitchen with the car keys, about driving those 6.5 miles and praying with every stoplight, about walking into my courtroom the next morning and deciding that he would rather face whatever consequence came from the truth than spend one more second carrying the weight of a lie. He wrote, "I learned that morning that honesty isn't just about what you say, it's about what kind of life you decide to live." And I decided to live an honest one. The essay got him into the finalist round for a full scholarship to a state university. I don't know if he got it ultimately, but the fact that he was in that conversation, the fact that one morning's courage had opened a door that might change the entire direction of his life, that's everything. That's the whole point. I think about that day often. I think about what it taught me. I think about the layers of it. A teenager who saved his mother's life and then stood in my courtroom and offered me the truth, every piece of it, even the pieces that didn't make him look perfect. And a woman with every advantage who couldn't do the same simple thing with a pile of parking tickets. I don't say that to be cruel to Miss Hargrove. I say it because it illustrates something real, something important, something my father tried to teach me, and something I've spent 40 years watching play out in 1,000 different ways. Character is not a function of what you have. It's not related to your bank account or your address or the label on your coat. Character is built in the quiet moments, in the moments when you decide how to behave, when the stakes are real and the choice is genuinely hard. Marcus had almost nothing by the material measure of things. He had worn sneakers and a part-time job and a mother who needed him. And he had more character in those 6 words, "Your Honor, I don't want to lie," than I see in some people twice his age with twice his resources. My father came to this country with nothing. He worked until his hands were rough and his back was bent, and he never once told me that money was the measure of a man. He told me the measure of a man was how he treated people who couldn't do anything for him, how he behaved when nobody was watching, whether his word meant something. Those are the things I've looked for from this bench for 40 years, and when I find them, I feel what I felt that October morning. I feel like it's all worth it. I've been asked before, usually by young law students who come through the courthouse, whether I ever get tired, whether 40 years of seeing people at their worst ever wears you down. My honest answer is that I don't mostly see people at their worst. I mostly see people under pressure. And pressure is different from bad character. Pressure reveals character. Sometimes what pressure reveals is beautiful. A mother who worked 2 jobs and raised a son who knows the difference between right and wrong. A 17-year-old who drives 6 miles to save his mother and then walks into court the next morning ready to own every bit of it. So let me ask you this. Do you think I was too easy on Marcus? Should I have still given him a penalty given that he broke the law, even with those circumstances? I'm genuinely curious what you think. These are the kinds of judgments I wrestle with, and I want to know where you stand. And here's another question for you. If you were in my position that morning, with both of those people standing in front of you, the honest teenager and the evasive professional, what would you have done? Would you have handled either case differently? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I actually read them, every single one. If this story meant something to you, if you believe that honesty matters and that character is more valuable than anything money can buy, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Turn on that bell icon so you never miss another story from my courtroom. Because every week I come here with another case, another person, another moment that reminded me why justice matters and why the truth is always the place to start. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. Someone raising a teenager who needs to know that honesty, real honesty, the kind that costs something, is the most powerful thing they can give that child. Share it with someone who has forgotten that character is built choice by choice, in the small moments, not just the big ones. And check out the next video on your screen. I've got another incredible story from my courtroom that you won't believe. I'll see you again very soon with another lesson about justice, respect, and what really matters in this life. I'm Frank Caprio. I've been on this bench for 40 years because I believe something simple. We're all equal before the law, every single one of us. Rich or poor, powerful or powerless. The teenager with the worn sneakers and the woman with the expensive handbag. They stand on the same ground when they stand in front of me. That's not a line from a textbook. That's what I believe with every part of who I am. It's what my father believed. It's what I'm going to believe until the day they carry me out of that courthouse. And a 17-year-old kid named Marcus Webb, on a clear October morning in Providence, walked in and reminded me exactly why. Thank you for listening to my story. God bless you. And remember, respect costs nothing, but it's worth everything.